I wanted to talk today about how it is that the family court is turning victims into perpetrators. It's pretty cruel. It's happening every day. And I wanted to sort of walk through with you how that is happening in order that possibly, if you're heading towards family court, you can just be aware of it. And in order to do that, I'm going to share three different cases with you. Two where here at McKenzie Picave we represented mum, and one where we represented dad. And the differences between those cases and what happened in order to take those three individuals from being the victim to being the perpetrator in terms of the eyes of the court. Okay, let's kick off. But before we do that, let's run the intro. Okay, let's start with mum. Mum's story is quite a tragic one. She's got two children. She was in a relationship that was not violent, not abusive. It was just running out of time. And that happens sometimes with relationships that we're in. It just kind of run its course. Her and her husband were just drifting apart. And so she reached a point where she felt that the relationship was quite loveless. And so she felt that the appropriate thing for her to do was to leave. She felt that was best for her husband, best for her, and best for the children. So she had a conversation with her husband where she said, look, one of us needs to go. So what I'm going to do is, because I've got family nearby, I'm going to move out of the family home and go and live back with my parents just while we work this out. And we'll just obviously, because the children don't need to see us estranged. They don't need to see us at loggerheads. It'd be much easier if I'm down the road and then we could just work it out as two civilised adults. So that was the stance she took. So mum left the family home, left dad in the family home with the two children. And they endeavoured to try and work out what they were going to do next. A couple of weeks goes past, and mum has chosen to let the dust settle a little. So she's kind of stayed away. She has stayed away from the family home. She's had a couple of phone calls with the children, but she's just really just kind of letting the dust settle, letting some of the emotion to run out of the situation, in the hope that obviously her and her husband can then work something out that's in the best interest of the children. A couple of weeks goes past. She phones the husband in order to say, I'm going to come round this afternoon, come and spend some time with the children. So I'll see you later. And that was it. That was kind of where she expected the conversation to go. But her husband said to her, I don't want you to come round. I don't want to see you. And the children don't want to see you. And she was quite shocked by that. And a bit of a heated conversation ensued, a bit of a heated dialogue, where she said, well, of course the children want to see me. I'm their mum. Don't be so ridiculous. She hung up out of anger, with the intention of obviously just going round. So she went round to the house later that day, and she knocked on the door, and her husband came to the door and stood in the doorway in order that she couldn't get in. And she could see the two children in the kitchen, sort of at the end of the hall. And she called to the two children, and they turned their backs on her and completely ignored her. And then the dad said, I told you, they don't want to see you. They never want to see you again. And that's a pretty hurtful thing for any parent to hear, that your children never want to see you again. She left very upset. A couple of days went past. She let the dust settle, and she thought she would go back and try again. She went back, knocked on the door, and this time her daughter answered the door. And her daughter said, we told you we don't want to see you. And then her daughter slammed the door in her face. Mother was distraught. She came to see us here at McKenzie Picave, and we explained to her the process of family court and what would happen and how it is that we would work with the court system in order to secure a sensible arrangement with the children and try and get some common sense back into whatever was happening here. So Where are we so far? We have a couple who are married and their relationship starts to break down, and it's breaking down because they've just run out of time together. They've run out of love together. And so the sensible thing to do is for them to split up and just focus on how best to move through the next stages of their lives. So mum makes that decision, agrees it with the father, agrees it with dad, and she moves back with her parents. And then a couple of weeks goes by, and then suddenly she's alienated from her children because her husband, and let's surmise it is her husband has then been talking to the children and indoctrinating the children and manipulating the children in that they want to make the statement that they don't want to see their mum. We took them out into court. It took a couple of months from the point of application to the first hearing. We attended the first hearing. I was there was supporting mum, and dad was there with a legal representative. And the legal representative stated on behalf of dad that she had written letters from the children that she wanted to present to the court, stating that they had no wish to ever see their mother again. Now, at this first hearing, CAFCAS had carried out obviously their safeguarding, which they do at the start of every process. So they'd carried out their initial safeguarding. And in their initial safeguarding, they stated the fact that the children had stated to them categorically that they didn't want to see their mother. Can we see what's happening here? Can we see this change of tone? Because suddenly mother, who started out with good intention, believing that the best thing to do was to remove the conflict and the acrimony from in front of the children by stepping outside the family home, she's now alienated from the children, and there is some undertone in terms of CAFCAS's report back that suggests that mother has possibly done something wrong, because CAFCAS's recommendations for mother in terms of how she initiates her contact back with the children, their recommendation is that mother has indirect contact only in order not to distress the children whilst they investigate what is going on. Now let me explain to you what that means, indirect contact. Indirect contact means that mother cannot speak to her children, she cannot see her children. All she can do is send them letters on a weekly basis in the hope that they then reply. And that's all she can do. And so in the space of 3 months from realising that her marriage is over to her standing in a family court, suddenly mother is the perpetrator. Suddenly mother is the one who has done something wrong in the eyes of the court, because the court feels so concerned about mother that the court has told her that she can only have indirect contact with her own children. Here we are a number of months down the road from that first hearing. Mother still only has indirect contact with her children. Mother is still viewed, whilst these proceedings are going on, mother is still viewed as some sort of perpetrator, as having done something wrong. There is something fundamentally wrong with that. There's something quite cruel in that. Because if we just imagine that lady took a decision in the best interests of her children in order to safeguard their mental health, so they didn't have to be subject, so they didn't have to witness the conflict in the household. She took that decision, and here we are a few months later down the road, and she is now the perpetrator. The general view is that she has clearly done something wrong, and by virtue of that, all she can do is write letters to her children. Victim to perpetrator. Let's take a look at another example. We have a dad in our care who is a good guy, has a very good job, very successful. Him and his wife and their little girl had a very happy life, a very successful life, a very privileged life. Lovely house, lots of holidays abroad, very nice cars, all the things that we strive for in life to be a success. Mum had an affair. Mum had an affair with a family friend, as it happens. And the dad, our client, he became aware of it, and obviously was devastated and angry and all those things that that are triggered in you when you find out that somebody that you believe you love, somebody you believe you're in a loyal and honest relationship with, decides to have an extramarital affair. So Mum did. Dad left the family home because he didn't want to be there anymore. So he left the family home, and he started to see that his daughter, just a couple of times a week, he would pick her up and they'd go off and they'd do stuff together. And he was renting a house around the corner, and he'd pick her up and they'd do stuff. They'd do dad and daughter stuff. He'd take her to a gymnastics class, and they'd go for a burger afterwards, and the things that people do with their children. Dad came to us and said, I need to formalise. He's working with another practice on his divorce, but he came to us to talk about his child issue, and he needed to formalise an arrangement. He felt that was the appropriate thing to do, was to get a sealed court order that explained, so that there was no room for misinterpretation, that explained when he could see his daughter and what that would look like. We began that process for him. And I have to say, rightly or wrongly, I surmised it was going to be a pretty straightforward process. Two professional, successful, civilised people with a little girl, and between them, I have no doubt we're just going to negotiate this and get something perfectly sensible for both of them that is in the best interest of the child. We came to the first hearing, and at the first hearing, we were talking with the judge in a fairly informal environment. To be honest, we were talking with the judge, just laying out what was happening, just laying out the circumstances, laying out the history of what we had here. And Dad, during that chat, said to the judge that obviously his estranged wife had an affair. He wasn't vitriolic about it. He wasn't aggressive about it. He just made a very matter-of-fact comment that the reason for the breakdown and the reason that we were all in court on that day was because his wife had an extramarital affair. The change in attitude of his wife, of Mum, on that day was remarkable. You could almost see her adopt an entirely different position in that court as a result of him mentioning the affair. She became confrontational. She became aggressive. She became very, very uncooperative. The judge was trying to strike an early deal, and she became very, very uncooperative. And it was going nowhere fast. And the judge was doing his best, but struggling to try and attain some agreement between these two parties. And we were clearly heading towards another hearing, and clearly heading towards everybody getting the opportunity to write down their positions and proposals, etc. At this point, the judge had no reason to want to include Cafcass beyond their initial safeguarding letter, because there was nothing that Cafcass had raised. Nothing. They said they were two people who'd split up, and we just needed to sort the child out. So they'd raised no other safeguarding issues. And then Mum said this. Mum said to the court, but then of course there's the abuse. And a silence fell across the room. And the judge said, what do you mean by that? And Mum said, he, i.e. Dad, has an unhealthy interest in his daughter. And the silence continued to reign, and I'm looking at Dad, and Dad is buckling in front of me. And Mum then went on to say that her husband, the father of the little girl, would engage himself too intimately, her phrase, in daughter's bath time. He was spending too much time with the daughter when she was in a state of undress. And the insinuation was distasteful. The insinuation was abhorrent. The insinuation was that Dad was in some way a sexual abuser, a child abuser. In the space of 60 seconds, the tone of those proceedings changed fundamentally from what could have been a very civilised process where we arrived at a conclusion, where we arrived at a contact arrangement for the little girl that was in her best interests and a co-parenting solution. That could have been where we'd gone with that. But we didn't, because in the space of that 60-second window, Mum took those proceedings and turned them into something heinous. She turned Dad from being the victim in these proceedings. He hadn't had the affair. Mum had had the affair. It was Mum who had brought the marriage to an end as a result of having the extramarital affair. But suddenly Dad went from being the victim to being the perpetrator, because now he's carrying the label of being a child abuser. And the court has two people stood in front of it, Mum and Dad, and the court doesn't know either of them from Adam, and the court can't draw an opinion on either of them. The court has to make a conclusion. The court has to make a direction that is in the best interests of the child, that is in the safe interests of the child. And so consequently, the court has to take the worst case view. And the worst case view is that Mum is telling the truth. And so the court drew an order that said that Dad stopped seeing his daughter. And Dad didn't see his daughter for well over 12 months. That process, that proceeding is finished now. And Dad is now back in contact with his daughter. But he has to try and rebuild about 14 or 15 months of absence when he wasn't in her life. And when her mum had moved on, new partner, new relationship, all moved in together, all very happy families, and Dad had been alienated and Dad had been kept outside that, and now he's got to try and rebuild. And so again, in the space of one conversation, Dad has gone from victim to perpetrator. Our third case is a mum again who's in our care. She's still in our care currently. She was in a violent, abusive relationship. She was in a horrible domestic relationship with a man who was physically, mentally, emotionally, financially, sexually. He was delivering the whole gamut of domestic abuse over the course of the couple of years that they were together. She was being abused on a daily basis. They had a baby. The baby was 7 months old, and Mum took one beating too many. One night, Dad got into a rage about something totally trivial, and he beat Mum, and he beat her so hard that he cracked her eye socket, and she ran from the house in absolute terror because she thought this was the night that he was going to kill her. And she left the baby. She left the baby because in that moment, her terror, her fear was all consuming. So she ran, and she ran to a neighbour, and the neighbour rang the police, and the police collected her, and they took her to hospital. And when she left hospital after 2 days, she returned to her parents, and her parents rang the dad and said, "We would like to come and collect the baby because it's obviously in the best interest of the baby to be with Mum." And the dad said, "No. If she wants the baby, she needs to come home." And obviously that was never going to happen. She had had enough. She'd reached the end of her tether. So we get involved. Social services get involved. Social services go off and do an assessment. They have a statement from Mum which she worked out in conjunction with ourselves. So they have a statement whereby Mum explains the fact that the degree of abuse that she'd suffered. She's got photographs, umpteen photographs, showing injuries that she'd received. She's got text messages, she's got emails, she's got demonstrations from her bank accounts about how he controlled the money. The whole thing was ugly. The whole thing was desperately distasteful and unpleasant. So social services begin an investigation. They go off and see Dad. And social services, who I appreciate, are under immense pressure and who I appreciate are under-resourced. Social services deliver a report a week later that says, we've been to see the father, we've seen the baby is safe and well, and so there is no further involvement for social services. They drew a line under it. Their view was the domestic violence was over now because Mum and Dad were not together. Consequently, that issue had gone away. Their sole concern was whether the baby was safe. In their view, the baby was safe. That's it. Our role here is done. In court, we were granted an emergency hearing because of the nature of what had gone on, and we put our position. We put our position about the vulnerability of Mum. We put our position about the fact that Mum feared for her life on that night, and that's the only reason, and that's reason enough. But that is the only reason that she left without her baby. And now we would like the court to rule in this matter, but to recognise, and we had this conversation with Kafkas, but to recognise that it's in the best interest of the child to be with Mum. Mum is the victim here. It is Mum who has tolerated and suffered 2 years of abuse. It is Mum who carries the physical scars. It is Mum who carries the mental scars of 2 years of abuse. Now she just wants to be reconciled with her baby and then try and work out what to do with her life. The court's view was this. We don't know Mum. We don't know Mum from Adam. And currently we haven't investigated whether Mum's allegations of domestic abuse are true or real. So we can't draw a view on that. We don't know Dad. We don't know Dad from Adam. And so we can't draw a conclusion as to whether Dad is a domestic abuser. What we know, the only thing we know, is that we have a report from social services that says the child is with Dad and the child is not at risk. Imagine being Mum. Imagine the hole that is forming in the middle of your heart as Mum when you hear a court say that the baby is going to stay with Dad while they investigate your allegations. You ran from that house on that night as a victim. You leave court on this day as the alleged perpetrator. The family court system, whilst I have still a large degree of faith in it to arrive at the right decision, the steps along the way can often appear cruel, can often appear unjust, and often we find parties in a matter trading position. And the victim for a period of time becomes the perpetrator, and the perpetrator for a period of time, in the eye of that court, becomes the victim. Here at McKenzie Picave, we work with clients and we strive to put justice into every set of proceedings that we manage, and we strive to secure an outcome that is fair and right and appropriate for the child. And if that's something that we can do for you, in order that you can be recognised as the victim, in order that you can be recognised as the one who is right in a set of proceedings, do get in touch. Thanks very much for watching. If you want to learn more about Daniel Picave Counselling, watch that video. If you want to learn more about McKenzie Picave Family Law, watch that video. And remember to subscribe, because 68% of you haven't. See you next time.